Okay, we're going to start because we have a tight timetable for this session. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Chinny MacDonald. I'm Head of Public Engagement at Christian Aid. I'm standing in for my colleague Pete Morey, our Head of UK Advocacy and Campaigns, who's unable to make it due to a family emergency. I'm delighted to be joined in this session, which is going to fly by 5 great speakers. Some of them are yet to join the call, so we're hoping that they will be there, but even if they don't join, we will have plenty to discuss. We are proud at Christian Aid to be working on issues of climate justice and racial justice. And we have these 5 great speakers representing the church and politics. I'm going to read their bios so you know who'll be engaging in this conversation. First of all, we have Baroness Verma. Baroness Verma has held several key ministerial appointments in government and opposition since entering the House of Lords in 2006. A strong and committed advocate of diversity and inclusion, she is involved in a wealth of influential initiatives to create a more inclusive working environment and society. Baroness Verma was the Prime Minister's ministerial global champion for tackling violence against women and girls when she was a government minister. She co-founded Powerful Women as an energy minister when she saw the lack of senior women in the energy sector. And this has helped change the way women are supported in the sector by the senior leadership of the sector. She's also chair of UN Women UK, the National Committee of UN Women, the only UN organisation that focuses specifically on women and girls. We'll also be joined by Robert Beckford, who is a scholar, activist, currently working as Professor of Climate and Social Justice at the University of Winchester, Professor of Black Theology at the Queen's Ecumenical Foundation and VU University in Amsterdam. And also Reverend Alton Bell, pastor of Wembley Family Church and chair of Movement for Justice and Reconciliation. Reverend Alton is a qualified industrial chemist, a pastor, a writer and community activist. He is the senior pastor of Wembley Family Church, director of Sway Youth Project in Brent, and chair of the Movement for Justice and Reconciliation. He's particularly concerned with the disproportionate amount of Black youngsters underachieving educationally and of being ensnared by the criminal justice system. And then we have Pastor Joyce Fletcher, who is an ordained minister, trustee, and currently serves as the National Women Family Ministries Director within the Church of God of Prophecy UK. But she has provided strategic leadership as a member for England on the Nursing and Midwifery Council, a strategic professional body that provides the accountability frameworks for policy, practice, and public protection of the profession across the UK. Most recently, she has led the faith response to COVID-19 as part of the Chief Nursing Officer team at NHS England and raised the profile of psycho-spiritual support to be embedded in the work of the NHS, and lots of other things that I could have said. And then we'll also be joined by Belle Ribeiro Addy, who's a Labour MP for her home constituency of Streatham. Born and raised in Brixton Hill, Belle is a committed Christian and a dedicated feminist, anti-racist and trade unionist. After her election, she served as Shadow Immigration Minister under Jeremy Corbyn. Prior to this, she worked for Diane Abbott as political advisor and chief of staff. So what an amazing panel of people we have to talk to us this afternoon. We're delighted to welcome them. What we're going to be doing is hearing, first of all, 2-minute reflections from each of the panelists on why racial justice is at the heart of climate justice. Then I'll share a bit more about Christian Aid's work on climate justice. Then we'll have some quick fire panel discussions for the politicians and then the church leaders. And I'll share a bit about what Christian Aid has learned in this area. We hope to finish by 2:50 on the dot. So if there is time at the end, we'll also have questions from the audience, but please feel free to post some questions in the chat and I can see if I can weave them in. So first of all, on the first 2-minute reflections, I'd like to go to Pastor Joyce, if you're happy to start and share with us your 2 minutes on why racial justice is at the heart of climate justice.
Thank you so much. So I've been introduced. My name is Joyce. I am the National Women's Ministries Director for Church of God of Prophecy UK, which has over 1.5 million members and operates within 135 nations across the globe. I've been really captivated by the theme of the parliamentary breakfast today of renewed hope, because my hope has been renewed in this whole area of climate justice. People like me, certainly I hadn't made the obvious link between climate justice and racial justice, and certainly from a women's and church leadership perspective, there's much work for us to do in helping others to also have this renewed hope. So in 2 minutes, climate change interacts with and worsens existing inequalities in society that are often shaped by racism. From a public health perspective, there's an inherent link between poverty, social deprivation, and racial inequality linked to population health. The poorest people tend to suffer the worst at every level, both nationally and internationally. And in the recent words of MP David Lammy last year, he shared that the whole world echoed the final words of George Floyd, "I can't breathe." And he reminded us of the case of Ella Adu Kissy Deborah, a 9-year-old Black girl who literally could not breathe and died from an asthma attack here in London after being admitted with seizures 27 times in the 3 years prior to her death in 2013. Last year, 2020, the coroner's inquest found that she died as a direct result of air pollution. I'm just giving this as just one example. I want you today to think about this question: how many people cannot breathe? Helping people to breathe is all of our responsibility, is part of my responsibility. So I challenge us, what will we do in this whole area of climate injustice and racial injustice? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Some really important points there. We'll move on then to Baroness Verma and then to Robert.
Thank you, Chinny, and it's wonderful to be here with you, and thank you to Christian Aid for arranging this important session. And following on from Pastor Joyce, it's a great pleasure, because she raised some great points, which gives you time to actually sit back and think that it doesn't have to be far away for things to be impacting indiscriminately. And, you know, whilst we do talk about racial justice and climate justice, as Pastor Joyce said, everything tends to be very much linked. I've grown up knowing that you have to battle hard to get your voices heard. And by battling hard, what you're managing to do is to actually shine a torch, a light on issues around you. Now, the difficulty we have, of course, is that we know climate is going in the wrong direction. We know that there'll be countries that will be subsumed underwater. We know that dirty diesel, dirty fuels have been used for far too long by parts of the world that the rest of the world has now got to clean up. And I think it's really, really incumbent on all of us today to sit back and say, how do we make our difference? As an energy minister, it was really brought home to me that actually nature has given us so much, and yet we have failed to really harbour and really utilise to the best of our abilities what nature has bestowed upon us. And the fact that we still, and the pandemic has really highlighted this, to me, the pandemic has been the one event that has taken the lid off everything to demonstrate to the world how unequal we are, we remain, and we will still be if we do not wake up and smell the coffee, that unless we are all safe, unless we are all able to access the same opportunities, the same healthcare, the same education standards, that we will have this disparity, and the poorest, regardless of where they are in the world, will always be the ones that will lose out. So I will stop on that, Ginny, because I know these are reflection moments. But actually, this subject is so huge and it is so interlinked, and we are still so vile with each other that we are willing to say that we will vaccinate ourselves, but let the rest of the world wait. Well, I'm afraid for me, that's not good enough.
Totally agree, and we can maybe draw on some of these issues of justice and inequality a bit further later on. But over to Robert. Belle, welcome. We're continuing our 2-minute reflections, and then we'll come to you after Robert.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Climate change is racist because climate vulnerability is divided along racialized lines. The most affected are disproportionately people of color, either in the global south or, in our domestic case, poorer black and brown people in highly urbanized parts of Britain. At the international level, the vulnerability to greenhouse gases is unequal. Studies show that the top fifth of the most carbon polluting countries, the USA, Canada, UK, are in the lowest fifth of vulnerable countries. This situation is partly because richer countries have the ability to mitigate most of the consequences of global warming. At the other end of the scale, in contrast, the countries that are likely to suffer because of their inability to mitigate against the negative consequences of climate change are the small islands, such as those in the Caribbean and a cluster of countries in Africa. Now, I'm not saying that climate change is specific to black and brown people or communities in the global south, but African and Caribbean countries will bear the brunt of it in terms of floods, water scarcity, tornadoes, increased political conflict over scarce resources, climate change, refugees, and the misery of war. The environmental inequality is also racially indexed in Britain. Black Lives Matter protest at City Airport in 2016 made legible the connection between climate crisis, climate privilege, and climate violence. Newham, where City Airport is located, is predominantly black. It's got the least amount of white residents than any authority in the country. And in parts of London, African and Caribbean people are disproportionately more likely to breathe illegal levels of air pollution than their white or Asian counterparts. And across the UK, the picture is equally disturbing. Black communities in Britain are 28% more likely than their white counterparts to be exposed to air pollution. We know there is a link between economic inequality and exposure to polluted air and harmful UV levels. We also know that economic inequality has a racialized dimension, as has just been mentioned, which leads to double vulnerability, especially for black women. What we are not always willing to accept is what economic and environmental historians tell us about the genesis of the link between environmental degradation and racism. It goes way back into the rapacious, avaricious context of racial capitalism, slavery in the Caribbean, and the malfeasance, the greed of colonial extraction in Africa. To address these issues, we need to return to what the biblical text tells us to do, the radical Christian empathy, and radical action on environmental safeguarding and green interventions, and reparatory justice, reparations, both overseas and at home. Thank you.
Wow, so much in there. Thank you, as ever, Robert. Belle, over to you for your reflections.
Thank you very much. And I suppose all I could say is there's not a word that Robert said that I don't agree with, and that I wasn't planning to repeat. But I'll leave that because he did it so well. But he's absolutely right. Climate change is racist, and one of the major things that we've seen more recently is quite a few campaigns, and the campaigns we've seen to raise the issues of climate change in the global north, as we would say, have been amazing. They've been great. They've raised a lot of awareness, but at times I feel like they've often forgotten diverse communities, and I feel like at times they've often forgotten that whilst the global north is becoming more and more aware of the effects of climate change, is actually now suffering more of the effects of climate change. The global south have been going through it for decades, have been raising it for decades, have been making that point for decades, and it's taken a long time for people to catch up to what the reality is. That be it floods, be it monsoons, be it hurricanes, be it all of those things that we know that are happening right now, or have been happening for decades right across the world. People in the global south have felt it they have called for change and they have often not been listened to. And it's important, as well as touching all of the other things that Robert has just mentioned, that that we have Black people, that we have people from the global south, from all ethnic minorities, centrally involved in environmental campaigns, because it affects our community so much, but also because it should be a global movement for change, and a global movement that doesn't reflect its full diversity is never going to be as effective as it should be, because it far too often leaves too many people out. Generally, across the UK, as you've heard, it is a case that the majority of our ethnic minority communities live in the poorest areas, and the poorest areas have the worst outcomes in terms of air quality. And we already know that people have been found to die from this. So it is yet another issue of social justice in terms of people actually just being able to live and breathe clean air, and on our ethnic minority communities that are most widely affected. And as things continue, as we look, I think particularly towards aid and how we're applying aid, I've always been quite appalled at a number of the decisions we've made in terms of giving aid. Firstly, I don't think we've given enough, and obviously more recently we're hearing about major cuts to aid. But where we have given money, a lot of the time we have been so short-sighted in terms of how we invest, and that's because too often our aid, definitely over the past few years, our aid has become an industry. It's become an industry in itself. And so giving a sub-Saharan African country money for energy and plugging it into certain types of unclean energy makes no sense to me. If a country is having issues with energy and it's in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries where there is a lot of sun, why would you not invest in solar panels? Why would you not invest in those new green renewable energies that will make a massive difference and actually end up costing these countries less, because the sun is free, as far as I know. And this hasn't happened because far too often we've put the profit above people. So if there's anything that we've got to do in the coming months, in the coming years, is we've got to make sure that when we're addressing issues of climate change, we are addressing issues of racism, we are addressing issues of inequality, but above all, we are making sure that we put profit above people, because some of the poor decisions we continue to make that continue to mean that people suffer are all because somebody wants to make money somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. There is so much to unpack in what each of you have said, and potentially when we go to the discussion time, you might reflect on what others on the panel have said. We're going to go into a question and answer time now, but before I go to Belle and Baroness Verma, and specifically asking about how churches can engage politically, I want us to reflect. I'm going to reflect now on Christian Aid's work in this area. Is to outline the work that we are doing. We're meeting today at a really critical time, having just had the G7, and we are just over 4 months from the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow. This is a key year for the world and for the nation. This summit will succeed or fail on whether it really delivers for the people and communities we've spoken about on the front line of the climate crisis. And that is what Christian Aid wants to highlight and wants to push for. As our panelists have said, this is an issue of justice. The people who are hardest hit have done the least to cause the crisis that now threatens them. So what do we at Christian Aid want to see delivered at the COP? Well, first, we need unprecedented action to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have been really clear on this, that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 could reduce the number of people exposed to climate risk and poverty by up to several 100 million. So we really need to walk the talk on net zero. And credibility is really key. As the COP26 president, the UK has to set an example to other nations. So it's really worrying when our Independent Climate Change Committee has just this week said that there's a gulf between the UK's promises and its actions. Now, this gulf has to change. And the second thing is that the COP must deliver a step change on financial support for communities on the front line of the climate crisis. These are the people Christian Aid is here to serve. And this finance must help communities to adapt to climate change and to manage the loss and damage that results from it. Over 10 years ago, the world's rich countries agreed to deliver $100 billion a year in climate finance by 2020. So there's lots that we are calling for in this area. It's a key year. Over these next few months, you'll be seeing lots of activity from Christian Aid on these areas as we lead up to COP26. But now over to questions, and just if there are questions from those watching, if you'd like to post them in the chat, and I will look at them as we go. But the first question, if I could start with Belle, again, this is a question about politics. What is the best way for churches and Christians to engage politicians on the issues of climate justice and racial justice? So first Belle and then Baroness Verma.
I think certainly by making yourselves known and making sure that you are contacting your MP on these issues. Some people think to themselves, oh gosh, don't want to bother, don't want to send too many emails, or are the emails I'm sending making a difference? In my view, they certainly are. Sometimes campaigns will get attention simply because an MP's inbox has been flooded. And whilst I'm not, for my other MP colleagues who may be listening, not saying that everybody should flood MP's inboxes, I'm making it clear that you need to make clear to your elected representatives what your views are on issues, and you need to do it en masse. I think it's also worth church groups and church leaders coming forward as a group and saying this is what the group has said to individual representatives, and making there is an organised collective somewhere that is making these points on climate justice. So I think it is about organisation and making sure your representatives are making your views clear in Parliament.
Thank you, Belle. Baroness Verma.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jenny. It's a question that when I was minister at DFID, I asked what faith groups were doing on a range of issues, because faith groups were talking in echo chambers, but they weren't coming out and looking at how they could either work together or what they could say to government. Have you explored this idea? Have you looked at what we can do and deliver on the ground? And that was way before this discussion that we're having today. And I think the difficulty I had with listening to faith groups was that they weren't joined up enough to collectively work together. And I think it's a big failing, because actually faith groups have always been at the heart of community, and they've always been at the heart of the big decisions of the day. And I think for a number of years now, faith groups have really not been on the forefront of those discussions. And I think it's really important that we all take up responsibility. And that goes across all faiths. We step up when we see a crisis, but actually the crisis is always there. There is always something that we need to be making sure that we're constantly ahead of. So whether it's like Belle mentioned about, the work we do as a country, we are often at the forefront of showing how aid is delivered better. But, we also, and I agree with you, Belle, totally, it's about being able to look at the resources of those countries. How do we skill up the people in the countries that we're actually delivering into? And whilst I'll put it as a mark of registering my interest, looking at renewable energy as an energy minister really sparked my whole understanding of how good renewable energy could be for the planet. And, the first thing that I wanted to do was have a look at those countries. And, I'm Indian born, but, I watched what their country was doing, upping the game on solar energy, and thinking, why aren't we supporting those programs better? So there is a lot that politicians can do, but they need to be also some ownership and responsibility being led from the front by faith groups. And I think often, you know, when there's a big crisis, they step up. When the crisis dies down, it feels as if, you know, they're back in the peripheries again. And I don't think that's the place for faith groups. I think the faith group should be at the center of community. Even today, you know, just looking at UK cities, we need our faith groups to step up ever so much more now than ever before, because we have got not just climate crisis around the corner, we've got mental health crisis, we've got health crisis, we've got a range of crises that we need to deal with. And where do we go to when we need support? It will always be the faith groups.
Here, and we've been really encouraged to see how churches and other faith groups got together during the G7, and we at Christian Aid really believe that the church is a force for good, and when we work together, when we collaborate, when we plan ahead, that we can really have an impact. So we're hoping to do much more of that over the next few months. Before we turn over to the a church question, I wanted to share with you just some key findings that we found from a report that we did last year with Savanta Comres. There are some assumptions about Black Christians or Black people's engagement in climate justice. So we asked in the first survey of its kind, what were Black Christians' views on issues of climate change? What were the barriers that there might be to engaging with the climate movement? So I'll just run through 5 of the things we learned. First, we learned that Black Christians feel more informed about climate change than the general public. 2/3 of them feel they know at least a fair amount about climate change, compared to 49% of the rest of the population. 2, and this is really key, being born in a climate vulnerable country boosts awareness of the climate crisis, because often Black people here have family somewhere else who are experiencing and who are on the front line of the climate crisis. 3rd, by 50% to 15%, Black Christians are much more aware that the impacts of climate change disproportionately affect Black people around the world. We found that among the general UK public, many white people thought that climate change most affects white people globally. And 4, compared to the general public, Black Christians are twice as likely to make lifestyle changes to reduce their carbon footprints or engage in campaigns or protests, which was surprising and felt counter to what I think the assumptions are about Black people in protest. And 5th, more than half of Black Christians don't think the climate movement is racially diverse enough, compared to 33% of the British public overall. So the question of representation. So this is from a report called Black Lives Matter Everywhere, which I'll post a link to in the chat shortly. But now a question to Robert and Pastor Joyce about the church. First, Pastor Joyce, what do you think are the barriers that need to be overcome in order for Black Christians to engage in and be more prominent in the fight for climate justice?
First of all, thank you for sharing that report. And I was quite surprised by, well, pleasantly surprised actually, by some of the findings from this research, because I do think there is still a lack of awareness. I think that's one of the biggest barriers is awareness of the impacts of what people do practically on a day-to-day basis and how that impacts on climate change. So I think that's one of the issues. I think there's also an issue around, Baroness talked about that lack of joint-upness and the level of disjointedness across faith groups that gets in the way of people coming together with one voice. And I think there are echo chambers and there are some really good examples of good practice, and I could give some examples within the Church of God of Prophecy, but that's not what I'm here to do. But I do think along a number of fronts, not just in terms of climate change, in a number of areas, that we do need to harness that capital of coming together and speaking with one voice, and must use that as leverage within the system. So I do think that is also a barrier. I think thirdly, my third point would be about leadership and the voice of Christian leaders at decision-making tables. And I think that's an area that really needs to be strengthened. I think Robert and Belle were really strong on the link between, well, you said climate change is racist. And we do need to use that voice, use our Christian voice at those decision-making tables to raise these issues and to bring others along with us. So those are my 3 points that I think are barriers. And I think if I was to add a fourth, I think we need to engage our young people, children and young people in this whole debate within the school sector and the education sector much earlier in the process, so that we're actually breeding a culture where people are thinking about climate, and it's inherent in our thinking, in our practices, and the dialogue and engagement, and indeed actions that we take.
Thank you, Pastor Joyce. Robert, what else are the barriers?
Yeah, so I think there are 3 things. First of all, I think there is a politics of benign neglect from the government towards Black communities. It's been that way for the last 70 years. As a consequence of that, Black communities, Black faith communities haven't felt listened to. So part of the problem is when we've complained about issues around schooling in the 1970s, when I was growing up, government didn't want to listen. We had to set up our own Saturday schools. We complained about issues around the lack of funding for young people. Government didn't listen. We had to set up our own youth clubs and other institutions. We're complaining now about a raft of things affecting our communities, and government doesn't listen. So, you know, the first thing is we have to acknowledge is that there's been long-term political neglect and only really relying on Black votes when an election comes round. So we need to address that political problem by having real constructive lines of communication open all the time. I don't really necessarily buy the critique that somehow Black faith groups have been disjointed, or even that they have been echo chamberish. It's just the government hasn't listened. Numerous times number 10, but they haven't listened. We talked about stop and search. They did listen in the 1980s, still not listening now. So there's a huge issue around political, you know, benign political neglect of Black communities that needs to be overcome from the government side, first and foremost. I think the second issue is much more ideological. Part of the problem is that, again, in Black faith communities in particular, these issues are not singular. They are understood holistically. What theorists now call intersectionally. We've been talking about climate as part of economic, of political, Pan-African, historic disadvantage for the last 100 years. So part of the difficulty I've experienced is that when government has come with a single issue, we've been showing how they all connect in various ways and got frustrated by the fact that our intersectional approach wasn't being taken seriously. You know, so I think there's a need again to have some serious conversation about method and approaches to analysing a situation. Fortunately, because African-American scholars have pushed intersectionality, it's finally hit British universities as a way of thinking about these issues. So when it comes to issues around climate change, we've been talking about racism, environmental racism, for the last 150 years. So, you know, again, I think there's a problem in that sense in terms of what government needs to do in terms of thinking and accepting other modes of thinking around this issue. I think the third issue, why there is a barrier, is simply lack of funding. You know, Black church groups are self-funded. We don't get a penny from government. You know, we don't get any resource. So consequently, if we want to, for example, a project I'm running in Hampshire at the moment, we want to train offenders in green economy skills. And we're trying to use church-based resources. There's very low resource. So part of the problem is we've done an amazing job at empowering, transforming communities, producing great people. Look at rapper Akala. Learned his trade from going to a Saturday school set up by the church. And this can go on in terms of Black people who have made it through the context of the Black church empowering and supporting them. So part of the difficulty is, you know, we can't turn water into wine. We need resource in order to develop further the great work that Black church has been doing. So I think those three issues, benign government attitude towards Black communities, I think a huge ideological growth in terms of how we analyse the issues needs to be addressed. And thirdly, some adequate resourcing of communities that have been stretched and brutalised by government policy, stretched by COVID, psychologically damaged by George Floyd and the reality of state violence against Black people. So all of those things have to be addressed in order to have a meaningful conversation and develop meaningful partnerships going forward.
Thank you so much. There's so much in there, and clearly you're doing some really creative work down in Hampshire that I'd love to hear more about. I'm glad Baroness Verma is back. I just wanted to ask if anyone wanted to respond to anything that they have heard, and before we move into questions from the audience. If not, you touched on it a little bit there, Robert, but you mentioned COVID, and there's a question from Gio and Sheila. Has COVID been a rehearsal for the coming climate emergency, and how did we do in that? So any thoughts on how COVID might have prepared us?
I mean, I don't mind chipping in with some theological jargon, if that's helpful, but my analysis, my students' analysis of COVID is that it's apocalyptic. An apocalypso means unveiling, and an unveiling in the book of Revelation is about John saying to people, this is how the world works. This is the injustice, it's the inequality, it's the brutality, it's the way the states work. And this is how the poorest people are further ground down into the dust. So for us, it was an unveiling of the social inequalities that were already existing and how they were exacerbated by the crisis. Another theological term, though, that's quite useful is the prophetic. The prophetic means speaking truth to power. The 8th century prophets, 90% of their work is examining the social context and challenging the authorities to do better, giving hope to the disenfranchised, not the navel-gazing kind of clairvoyant stuff that often gets promoted as wrongly as the primary basis of the prophetic. So I think that it also isn't just about a rehearsal, it provides us with the opportunity of transformation. So the prophetic demands that we speak truth to power, that we examine how we can provide hope and how we can build systems and structures that will make us more resilient. So I understand it to be apocalyptic, but I'm also prophetic. I'm also hopeful about the capacity to transform the way we are so that we're more resilient to deal with these kind of global systemic problems in the future.
Ginny, can I just comment, because I'm mindful that I'm having terrible connection problems today, so just in case I suddenly disappear, forgive me. But I just wanted to follow on from what Robert was saying. And, you know, I think that for a long time, a lot of people have known that we have got a huge amount of problems building up. The difficulty has been that, you know, when you've got one thing any particular government focuses on at any one time, it means that everything else then gets not the sort of attention it requires. And also, if I just come back to my point on faith leaders across the world, I think, again, you know, it is incumbent on all of us. I mean, you know, I come from a faith that has been bedded in sustainability from forever. But when I look at actually my own practices of how sustainable I've been, I'm hugely guilty of lots of things that I haven't incorporated into my everyday life, which would have made the environment better. And having that education, I think it was Pastor Joy said, we need to make sure it's embedded into our psyche from a very early age. But I think what's come out of this crisis is that we've realized that actually, not only do we have to be kind to other people, because this pandemic has shown that we're all vulnerable to the same impact of a pandemic, what we've got to realize is that climate change in itself is not going to be discriminatory. It may have a greater impact somewhere else at this moment in time, but it will come to you and you will be impacted. And I have forever, ever argued, and this is why my interest has grown in sustainability in the renewable sector. If you want people to remain and build up their countries, then you need to put in the support measures to be able to let those countries thrive. Nobody, my father, my grandfather, wouldn't have traveled across the seas to another country if everything they needed was in their own country. And I think, you know, let's relook at our relationship with the world. And can I just say, I don't want us to pit one against another. I think we've done it for far too long. I think what this pandemic has shown is, and I genuinely believe it, is that we cannot get out of any crisis unless all of us are out of the crisis. And so if nothing else, our consciences should be pricked up now to say that, you know, I want to make sure that my brothers and sisters across the other side of the world are getting the same support that I want and expect in my country. And, you know, looking at some of the decisions that are made, and here I am going to put on my gender hat, because I have forever fought on the basis of gender equality. I honestly believe that had we had in the decision-making rooms many more women at that table, the decisions taken would have been very, very different. And I think it's really, really important that whilst we talk about all of the other issues, the biggest thing is that the lens that takes these decisions have been very much, regardless of where they are, very much framed in one type of thinking. And that thinking has not taken us to the advancements of prosperity globally, but to the poverty of globally across many, many more countries. And I think we need to be able to look at ourselves and say, what are we doing to step up? I fell into politics because I couldn't stand people who didn't understand people's problems, like my family's problems, talking for me. I think we are and need to be responsible for ensuring that our voices are heard. And I'll come back to the faith groups again. I think it starts very early. I think the faith groups are at the bed of community, and they need to really now demonstrate how they bring people together and give them the confidence to be able to say, we can challenge.
And if I just come on the back of that, I think there is a lot that faith groups, and I mean across all faith groups, some learning from COVID, how we have come together across the different faith groups, gelling to a single cause of our responses within local communities and nationally in support of COVID. And I think there are some, you know, just going back to Baroness, what you've said about gender, and think about some of our churches and faith groups. Some of our churches are predominantly made up of women. Now, 70% of some of the Pentecostal churches are made up of women. They may not be the leaders, but they're made up of women, as opposed to in terms of the genders. And I think there's a question in the chat that's about what are some of the simple things that individual members can do in society to make a meaningful difference. And I think we must capitalize on that. You know, for example, in the West Midlands, in Birmingham, they've just put in the clean air zone. And on a practical level, and I'll give an example, I've got 2 diesel cars. A few years ago, we were being encouraged to buy diesel because it was cheaper, it was cleaner. And now I'm in a position where I'm going to have to get rid of the diesel car. And I'm really annoyed. But actually, when you actually become more aware of the impact of air pollution and all of this, that actually you realize that I do have a part, every one of us. So, and mothers who are leading homes, leading families, if we get behind this and actually start to think on a practical level, I think there's a lot more that we could do for actually making a difference and galvanizing our communities. Whether you're of faith or not, I think just as a woman, you know, when you think about what's happening in some of the third world countries and children and so on, well, it bothers us. So let's get practical and let's think about those simple things. And I think it's a good point that's been made on that.
Thank you so much. One of my earliest encounters with the climate justice movement was attending the Mothers Rise Up march through London, which was about basically you know, saving the planet for our children. And in that march, I didn't see a lot of people who looked like me. So it's really key for us to engage Black women, Black mothers, and Black people in general in these issues that are so kind of fundamental to our children's futures and those who are already on the front line of climate change now. We've got a minute left. There is a question that has come in to me that I will throw out as a kind of closing reflection if anyone wants to answer, but it is a big one. It says, it seems that one of the core aspects of this highly intersectional issue is relational, a legacy of unjust relationships. How can we simultaneously address the underlying relational issues as part of addressing the deeply connected racial and climate crisis? And that is from Mercedes Williams. And does anyone want to have the final word on relationships?
I was going to say, I think Robert had touched on this issue earlier when he mentioned the issue of reparations. Now, I know for some it may seem like a bit of a strange subject in this, but there are many different forms of reparations we've heard about, and one of them is environmental. There's educational, there is literally finance, and there is just giving back some things that don't belong with us. But I think that starts with an apology for a lot of the atrocities that have gone past in terms of slavery and colonialism. And some people have asked, how does that relate to people that live in this country? Well, it's my view that if our government doesn't view people that live in other countries that look like us with respect, why would they view us in our own country with respect? Racism is so ignorant that it's literally just based on how we appear. And Black people in the UK and Black people abroad appear exactly the same. And until they're all respected equally, neither will be respected in either place. So that's just my view in terms of starting with those kind of reparational measures. And when people use the term reparations, it is literally to repair. So repairing those relationships has to start with respect.
Thank you so much, Belle. Wise words to end on. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to Pastor Joyce, to Belle Ribera Addy, to Baroness Thurmer, and to Professor Robert Beckford. Today is the National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast, and we as Christians believe in the power of prayer. So I would encourage you to please go into Christian Aid's website and to sign up to our global prayer chain, in which we're praying for the climate throughout this year. And I will post a link now into the chat. Thank you so much, and stay in touch. Thank you.